Welcome to the Conflict Consortium virtual workshop. Today we have, I'm going to destroy these names, but I'm going to try anyway. Francesco Amodio, Leonardo Baccini, Michele de Maio. I'm presuming that's okay. Security, trade, and political violence. And Getmansky will get us started with comments, and then we'll move on.
Hi, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Anna Getmansky from the University of Essex. I first want to say a few positive words that I really enjoyed reading this paper, and I think you connect to some of the literature that you might not be aware of, and you speak to some of the sort of like recent studies that I will mention to you later that I think you would benefit from connecting with. I will say some comments, but my goal is to help you think about how you can convince others about your findings. So that it might sound negative, but it's not because I don't like the paper in general, but because I want to sort of like perhaps throw you some ideas of how to strengthen your argument and your findings. So the first thing that I wasn't convinced by was the different or difference in difference framework. Because difference in difference relies on parallel trends assumption. And from what I see in the paper, you haven't shown parallel trends assumption, meaning that you don't show that before the introduction of the export control regulations, the localities that are heavily dependent on dual use items are similar in terms of unemployment, wages, violence to other localities that are less reliant on dual use items. And to show those parallel trends is basically crucial for your argument and crucial for you to argue any causal effect of the introduction of these measures. So that's number one. Another comment that, another issue that was not clear to me was your distinction between treatment and control. So from what I understand, the treatment that you have is not a binary treatment, but more of a continuous or ordinal treatment. If I look at the map on figure 1, I think, where you have those localities that are red, orange, yellow. So I understand that the treatment is not binary. So I think that thinking about this treatment as a continuous or ordinal measure is actually going to be, it makes it hard to argue in terms of diff and diff and to show those parallel trends. So I think that you should sort of like start thinking about maybe a binary measure of your treatment. That's my second comment. My third comment is you keep using the words quasi-experiment, and that's okay if you show parallel trends. But since you don't, I think you should invest a little bit more thinking in terms of addressing endogeneity problems, because you clearly acknowledge that the export control measures are enacted in response to security problems. And then you find that localities that rely more or are affected more by these measures exhibit higher levels of political violence. But this could clearly be due to endogeneity, right? So you could imagine a situation in which different levels of reliance on dual use items are also correlated for whatever reason with patterns of violence. And so localities that are affected by this are those that exhibit also prior higher levels of violence. So it goes back to this idea of showing parallel trends and also thinking perhaps of some other ways of addressing the endogeneity problem. Does anybody want to jump, or am I going too fast over?
You're great. Do you want to leave it there?
Like I don't have. So I have many more points. I don't know.
More points, but I think that's plenty to get us started. That's great. Okay. And Chris is having some technical trouble. Katja may be back with us, which would be awesome. Oh, we can. Yeah. So Katja is back. Hopefully Chris will. So I'm going to jump in and the role as chair on Tiller unless Chris can get that resolved. And so Leonardo, let's give you a chance to respond, and the queue is open, people.
Okay, thank you so much for those comments. Those are great. I must say I'm a little bit puzzled by so the whole point is this idea of parallel trend assumption. I'm a little bit puzzled by the fact that we don't discuss these you don't think we discussed this in the paper because it seems to me, but it's nice also to hear what others say, that like we do what is usually standard in this design. So so we have in fact a standard difference in difference, in which instead of like having like two dummies, treated and control, and pre and post period, we have a continuous variable, but that's not so unusual. It's called difference in difference with elasticity. In fact, like you can think about interacting a dummy always with a continuum variables, and this has been done in previous studies. So I don't think here there is anything like unusual what we are doing. And you're totally right that like here defending the parallel trend assumption is crucial. And so what we do what like it's standard practice in the literature. So we throw sector specific trend, both linear and quadratic, and we do the same with locality. So we have locality specific trend. And when we do that, you see like our results are similar. We also show, and I think that's fairly transparently, the fact that we show the effect of the treatment. I would call the treatment even if it's continuous by year. So starting from the beginning of our time span until the end. And again, we find that like we show that the effect is only statistically significant, both with respect to like economic outcomes and with respect to political violence in the post-treatment period. So after 2008, after the issuance of the dual use list. And you're also you're correct that again you're right. We can always do more. Another thing that we are doing to show that this. Our treatment is as random as possible. We correlate these with...
Hold on, Leonardo, can I just pause you right there and ask Anna, would you like to respond or clarify? Because you asked a question, Leonardo, and so I don't know if give her a chance to respond directly to that, and then we'll get back to where you were going to go. And the queue is open, Chris, but we're going back to Leonardo to finish his response, just getting a clarification. Yeah, Anna?
Oh, so when I said you need to show parallel trends, what I personally expect to see is some graphical presentation of the trend before 2008 and after 2008. So that before 2008 we see some really similarity or parallel trends in localities that are heavily reliant on dual use and those that are less reliant on dual use. And then after 2008, I would expect to see some jump in those that are heavily relied on dual use and those that are not relied on dual use. So from my understanding, I haven't seen it in the paper, but maybe I didn't read carefully enough. If it's there, it's good. So a more formal way of demonstrating parallel trends would be to interact the treatment dummy, which you don't have because your treatment is not a binary treatment, but you would interact the treatment dummy with the time trend, basically, to show that the time trend starts affecting in the year in which you claim that it affects. So you have something similar in the sense because you present those coefficients by year, but still, I don't see that they're parallel or they're similar, and I don't see a comparison between treatment and control group before 2008. So that was my comment.
Okay, Leonardo, then Chris is in the chair.
So I mean, I guess we basically disagree on this. I think I can show you a graph in which I have a parallel trend before the event, and then like you have an effect after. Still, a lot of people will not be convinced at all by this. So. Point taken that like there is no with observational data a perfect way to defend a parallel trend assumption. What we are doing is what I believe is standard in the literature, which is again looking like throwing like trend. So like sector specific when like our analysis at the sectoral level of locality specific trend. So interacting basically like each ID with like our time variables and throw that on the right hand side. That is, as far as I know, what Angris and Pischke suggest, and this is what is, I think, common practice in this literature. Let me add one thing that we are aware of this problem. What we are doing also is to show that our measure of so our treatment, so our variable we call intensity, ML in this case, is orthogonal to several locality level characteristics. So locality level characteristics that we take in the 90s, so like in the 1997, so very far from 2008. We take the first data, the oldest data available, and we show that the treatment, so like the intensity variable is orthogonal, so it's not correlated with variable capturing education, variable capturing employment, variable capturing the structure of the economy, so percentage of people working in manufacturing versus agriculture. So this is another way in which we kind of like trying to convince you that that the treatment is not correlated with other confounding factors, so at least locality level characteristics. As far as I know, this is what what we can do and what is usually done in with difference in difference. But if like other people have a different opinion, I would be very happy to hear those.
So Leonardo, I know Anna well enough to know that smile suggests that she strongly disagrees, but we could allow her to have a quick retort to come back, and or we will just continue to broaden this conversation. Rebecca, I see you had a one. Rod, you're up next, and then we'll move to Katja.
Okay, so I think I probably want to echo some of Anna's comments here. I mean, my sense of reading this is I know less about the mechanics of the difference in difference approach, but at least as I understand kind of a quasi-experimental design, is that it's meant to enable you to kind of avoid having so many controls in your setup. And at the moment, I think you need to have a much stronger case for why you actually have a quasi-experimental design in practice, and what does that look like? So it needs kind of unpacking, right? There's kind of a lot of assumptions going on there that it's a quasi-experimental design, and we will sort of follow along. But I found that unpersuasive at this point in time. I think you can make that case, but at the moment you really need to spend some more time on that.
Leonardo.
Okay, so I think it's a bit difficult to answer to this question because it's not even a question. So let me try to argue here. So the quasi experiment is I think fairly convincing, at least for the first, what I could call the first stage. So the effect of a security measure on economic outcome. And the reason why I'm saying this is that the dual use list was issued as part of a bunch of policies, security policies, that Israel enacted after Hamas won the election in 2006 as a reaction of that. And this measure is is banning 56 items, 66 goods that are like dual use, so you can use both for private in the private sector, then in the civilian sector, then in the military. And this effect is triggering this banning is triggering an economic effect. So you have a security measure that creates a negative economic externality. Now, think about that. You're skeptical about this, and you think that Israel had in mind economic issues in issuing this list. Well, I mean, if and this, I think Anna was suggesting this, although she didn't make this argument very explicit. But if Israel was trying to targeting localities for example, in which political violence was already high, then we should see that this would would make for a tough test to find any evidence of an increase in political violence, because the list was targeted not to make more difficult the life of the perpetrators of political violence, and we find the opposite. If on the contrary, there was any in any way the decision of issuing this list was somehow strategic for Israel for any related to any economic issues, which are important here, or security issues, we should see some anticipatory effect of this banning before 2008, and our results show that we find nothing. So nothing happened before 2008. You have a negative economic effect, a negative effect on wages and firms' output in 2009 and 2010. And you don't have an increase of political violence differentially before 2008. You only have an increase of political violence differentially based on the intensity measure post 2008. So this kind of it seems to suggest that basically actors were not anticipating that. Or at least this is what we find. Otherwise, we should find that effect will kick in before, or would be lower than what we find, because the issuance the issuance of the dual list was correlated with previous episode of political violence. So this is why we think that this is a quasi experiment, because the whole story is triggered by an economic effect that is caused by a security policy. So what we would call a negative externality produced by a security policy. That's why we use the word quasi experiment.
So, Rod, your objection was what he just outlined was not clear enough, or not compelling, or I'm not gonna call you out. Are you an anti-experimentalist? What's the deal, dude? Come on. You have to unmute in order to kind of get back in it. Oh, you love experiments. All right, fine. All right. We'll just go along with clarification. Katja, you're up. Unmute.
Okay. Since I joined a little late, I first wanted to say I really enjoyed reading the paper. It's very cool data. I'm glad to see that the crafting of studying economic effects, labor market effects along the lines of what Otter et al. Have been doing is sort of taking more hold in what we're doing. And I especially appreciated how sort of carefully crafted the research design was to try to establish all the points along the theoretical argument to give us what the different parts of the causal mechanism actually look like. What I want to push on a little bit is this notion of an economic effect. And I'm wondering whether you have any indication that the economic effect was attenuated over time. So generally, when we look at the economic interdependence and conflict literature, there's the old distinction between sensitivity, vulnerability. At some point, the targeted state is going to adjust, that this should show up to some extent in any kind of secondary effects that the economic damage is going to have. And so I would like to know whether you observe anything like that, and whether that has an impact on having the violence go back down again, whether there is actually sort of almost like an error regression going on over time. And if you don't have that, what does that tell you about the specific relationship, the extent of economic dependence that your targeted area has, and how well that, how would that limit how well your example travels to the broader literature?
Leonardo, before you go, will you remember that question? Not? Yes? You good? So I had a two-finger on that, and it was related in the sense that I was wondering, so if you had a band, right, and so you have the ban. What I imagined was adaptation, right? You're just like, okay, we can't easily get these components any longer. Okay, what do we still have available to us? And now what can we create? So I was expecting these kind of tactical adaptations to go on, but part of this came from, I wasn't quite sure where like the list was coming from. I'm just like, okay, so I just imagine you're a bunch of mad scientists sitting in the back going, okay, let's decompose this weapon and figure out what the components are, and then add that to the list. And if that's what's going on, then on the other end, is there a bunch of mad scientists that are building weapons that are kind of like, okay, these elements have now been banned. What can we use to continue fighting or otherwise kind of like maintain our adaptation? But that led to kind of a similar type of dynamic. I was wondering about that with regards to Katja's comments.
Okay, so two very good comments. So on the timing, so this is yeah, something that like we have to be like, we have to work a little bit harder on this. So that's what we at the moment. You saw in the paper. That's what we find in terms of timing. We find the economic, the negative effect on the economy. It's what I would call short term. So only in 2009 and 2010. Now, maybe we are not very clear on that in the paper. From 2010, the list was relaxed. And this due also to the international pressure of some international organization and also the US. So what means relaxed means that like some of the items were like excluded by the list. So were like, not banned anymore. So this works very nicely for us because of course we find this in terms of like the economic effect of the policy, it only lasts in the 2 years in which you have a particularly extended, so a particularly like severe banning of those goods. So this is regarding the economic shock. And remember here, like the story is that the economic shock triggers more political violence, like through mostly an opportunity cost story. So I become poorer. So like my opportunity cost of engaging in violence goes down, like the supply side of conflict increases. And so then we find that like the effect on political violence, if you look at like our graphs when we show the effect every year, it's actually what I would call long lasting. So you have that like the effect is statistically significant until 2014. So what's going on here? So here with this research design, we can only speculate, okay? But you might think that like, you might think of this so-called stockpiling effect in a sense that if you are like forced to join I would not call it terrorist group because that's probably not like the case of, but if you're like, if you become a fighter because you're poor at some point, it's not that easy to get out, even like when economic conditions go back to an equilibrium, and somehow like you're stuck in perpetrating political violence even after economic conditions are improving. So this is a possibility. Another possibility is that if this is not a story of political of opportunity cost, which sells very well in economics but doesn't sell very well in political science. So if this is more a story of grievances, which I think experts of the areas pushed us to also to explore this, because apparently that grievances is a clear trigger. If it's the grievances stories, so a grievances story is way more indirect. So I don't have to become poor personally to get upset and to do something against Israel. It's enough that like I see a negative effect on the community. And so if the grievances stories is more prominent, then you might see that like this effect is long lasting, even though the negative economic effect is only for 2 years. But again, I'm just speculating here. We don't have here the design to test. And actually, one thing we are really struggling, I don't know if you have a suggestion, that is how to disentangle the opportunity cost stories against the grievances stories. That's something it's totally under work at the moment in the paper, and we are like actually struggling with that. So if you have any suggestion, it would be good. So on your point, Christian, about how like this list is compiled. So Israel, of course, is not the only country that is banning some dual-use goods. So and dual-use goods are actually regulated internationally. So there is an official list of what is included as dual-use goods. And many countries, including the US, China, ban the export of dual-use goods to some, say, rogue state or problematic state. So the only difference of which is not a small one, the difference here in our setting is that Israel is the only country in the world that can ban the import of dual-use goods because they control the borders. In other words, the US can decide not to export dual-use goods to Somalia, but it cannot ban any import to Somalia because it does not control the borders, whereas Israel does that. And the second big difference is that this list that we are using in our paper, it's much more, it's much larger, so it's much wider in terms of coverage. So it covers more products than what a common, a usual dual-use list would include. In fact, Israel is one of the few countries that didn't join a particular convention or organization that regulates dual-use banning, exactly because Israel wants to have the flexibility to include in the list even goods that are not usually imposed in the list. But what is important here is that this banning, it's a banning of inputs, is a trade restriction, and we know that trade restrictions have a negative effect on economic efficiency, productivity. There is a large literature on that. I'm coming from trade, so I'm very comfortable to defend that. And this negative effect on firms generate a loss of output, a reduction of wages, and somehow in our story increases what I call the supply side of political violence. So that's the kind of framing that we have in mind.
So evidently, your last few sentences and last few minutes were quite cathartic because a bunch of people have some comments. Rebecca, we're coming to you, but before that we have Katja, then Ron, then Anya.
And I don't really have a solution for you here, but my main point is, and since you do know the trade literature fairly well, I'm sure you've heard all of this before, but you have a bit of a problem with the fact that the economic effect of the full-on embargo of the dual-use list is rather short, right? And so my question is, and maybe this is something you can address in the paper that you have data for, but for the particular economic effects that you are stipulating here to materialize, I'm wondering how long that would actually take. Because if you can see the dual-use list coming as a company, you could stockpile in working up to it, which would mean that the actual deprivation effects that you're stipulating would take a while to materialize, right? Or they materialize right away. The grievance effect, to the extent that it's not necessarily just about the economic deprivation, but the very fact that a dual-use list is imposed in a sort of a negative response just to the policy act, should materialize a lot faster than the economic effects would, right? And so I would just like to see in the paper you talking a little bit more just a little bit more extensively about how precisely the timing of some of these effects work, and to what extent with your data you can see whether this dynamic works out a little differently in this particular instance, since Israel has such more tightly control than we generally see, and then the trade literature generally assumes to be the case, right? So to what extent the dynamics timing-wise work out a little differently, and to what extent you need to take that into consideration given that the full dual-use list was only in place for such a short period of time, and how that affects what effects you're going to see and how your hypotheses play out. Just want to put that out there.
Rod.
Okay, I'll cede the field.
Thank you. Unmute, Rod. Yeah.
Okay. Will did say that was going to happen. So I guess I'm following on some of Katja's comments here, but perhaps thinking from a more kind of general theoretical approach is that at the moment I think that the theoretical section is too short and too dense, and I think you really have to more clearly explain kind of the logic of these two different sets of theoretical connections, right? So, for example, for your economic costs approach, right? Why are the targets more general? That's not clear to me. So why aren't they simply so why would people be then targeting, say, other Palestinians, which is, I think, the logic of your argument there, and also targeting the Palestinian Authority if the Israelis are actually the source of these problems? So why not, why not simply examine the link to what the Israelis are doing specifically? And then in terms of the grievances, it's not clear to me why, how you're actually getting at that, right? So what you're calling economic costs, you also flag up as potentially being grievances. But how do we differentiate between the two? I mean, I think there are ways of doing that, but you're interpreting behavior as a signal for one of these theoretical arguments, and it's not clear to me that it is.
Anna.
Just a quick comment. You don't have any evidence of actual reduction in dual-use exports or import by the Palestinians. So I think to make this argument, you actually need to show that this is the amount of dual-use items that they imported before the export control went into effect, and this is how this export control measure actually affected the actual, arrival of these items to the Palestinian Authority, because we don't actually know that they lost anything, that this measure is actually enforced. Just like Christian said, they could have found some other ways of importing those things, through Jordan, through other borders, smuggling. I mean, many things are smuggled into the Palestinian Authority. So I'm just putting it out there. And there are ways of getting data.
Good.
Can I answer to this?
Yes, of course.
This is crucial about how we think about identification, guys, because we have to be very careful. So our measure of intensity, intensity of use of dual use is not time varying, and is built on an input-output table from the US to be as exogenous as possible, 2002, and is built on labor market data 1997. You definitely don't want to make this time varying, and you definitely don't want to measure import, because import is endogenous to violence. So you want something that is as exogenous as possible, as far as possible from the event, in order to make sense of this from the causal point of view. So exactly because there is the possibility that you're smuggling goods, that might happen. In the West Bank a little bit less, in Gaza it would be easier with the tunnels, easier. But if this is the case, for example, we should not find any effect, because what you are saying that the de facto banning would not be effective, because people and therefore also firms, I imagine, would be able to use to have those goods anyhow. And so in my opinion, it's exactly because we want to make this as exogenous as possible that we don't want to use anything that is potentially endogenous to political violence, and it is too close to the event. If you're right, I mean, if the banning was completely ineffective, then we should not see any differential effect correlated with our intensity measures.
So my two on that is my argument, Leo, is in a sense, if the composition of a certain weapon made it, let's say, the intensity, the frequency with which activities were being undertaken is in part a function of a particular composition of the material. Something gets banned, and so you now need to use a new material, and perhaps that it has a greater kind of explosive yield, and it's harder to get. So that would decrease the intensity, but you'd still have conflict behavior as it's related. So if you're very much tied to the kind of generation of frequency of events, the dualist composition of the weaponry might then lead you to then engage in new types of activities, which then shift that relative frequency. So that was kind of my thing about leading to the kind of substitutability kind of bit of the components. Because once you got me thinking about components, which I'm not normally thinking about how do you build things that blow up, but I'm just kind of going, okay, if this composition is shifted, then you go to this, but this is harder to get, or the containing device for that, or you need more time to get away. It just seemed like there was a baseline presumption of that kind of demand for violence that you were kind of getting into. And I thought that was in part a function of what weapons you were using and how that was kind of like related to this dual use argument. So I bought in on the argument, but then I started thinking about weapon composition, and you don't give me much about the conflict, right? Like how it's fought, where it's fought, how much it varies across space and time. And so you got me thinking a lot about the frequency, but then I started thinking about how weapon composition factored into it and whether that was as important as bullet availability. I don't know exactly, right? So you got me thinking about the conflict, but then didn't give me enough on it. But Rebecca.
Sure, hi. So I'm Rebecca Cordell from the University of Essex, and I too really enjoyed the paper. One of the main parts that I'd like to push you on is how you frame it as being able to use this as an example to explain other situations, not just other dual use, but also other effects of security policies and also the effect of trade sanctions. And at least for me, I perhaps got quite tied up with the uniqueness of this situation. And so I would just like to hear more from you about how, since it's framed very much at the beginning to be able to speak to various types of literature, how you do consider your findings to be something you could expect also in other situations on those particular levels.
Thank you. This is a very good question, and indeed it's I think one of the crucial questions for like selling this paper. And here, like, you know, I have to be honest on what I can deliver and like what I cannot deliver. So now some of you don't even believe the identification strategy, although I don't understand really the point. But you know, but even if you buy the identification strategy, what I cannot say with this exercise, this is not a policy evaluation exercise. Why not? Because I don't have the right counterfactual for that. So I cannot answer to the question, what would happen to political violence in the West Bank if Israel didn't implement this de facto banning? And so you might think that, like, if you are like an Israeli a military guy, you can answer to this paper. Yes, of course, we know that there were like negative externality coming out of trade restrictions, but we did that to like take care of a high level political violence. So something like similar to the Second Intifada, and that's why we banned those goods. And of course, this created some like negative externality, some problems, but this is kind of like small scale like violence compared to the one that we were like fighting, which goes I think a little bit in the direction of the point previously made by saying, you know, so which kind of like which kind of political violence are we talking about? But let me put this on the side. I will come back and let me answer in terms of the framing. What I think we can show here, and I think this is pretty, and the results are pretty amazing in this sense. I think it's pretty unique. Is that we show that. When you mismanage trade, so when you create some trade frictions, even small trade friction with 56 items, you have pretty severe economic shocks, negative economic shocks. And the effect that we find is not trivial. We find like a 1.3 reduction in output, which is a small recession in an economy that is already struggling like the West Bank. And so even like small trade restrictions, security motivated trade restrictions, they can actually like mess things out, and they can actually create both economic cost and related to that political cost. So I don't think this is generalizable, for example, in terms of like economic sanctions in general, but I think I'm more comfortable to talk about this literature of the effect of trade on conflict. This literature tend to be pretty much usually at country level or dyadic level, so not very careful, not very. There is like the research design doesn't allow us to test the micro foundation of the relationship between trade and conflict. It doesn't help us a lot with causality. Whereas here we have a more micro test, more precise test to show the effect of trade restrictions on political violence. And I think this is something that we have generalized also to other countries. And as we say in the paper, but you might disagree, but as we say in the paper, if this were for the West Bank, so for Israel, which is one of the most powerful like army in the world, like Israel, they spend more than any other countries on the military, you might think that like the effect of trade restrictions on economic shock and then on political violence can be even larger in other countries when like when it's not Israel but is another country with like a smaller army. So I think that this I think it's the effect of trade and trade restriction on conflict is generalizable. I think beyond this particular study. I think.
Nikki. Muted. You're muted. Yeah.
Sorry. Hi, everyone. I did enjoy reading a lot of this paper, so let me offer some brief comments. So I come to this more from a sanctions perspective, and thank you for those comments on sanctions. I was going to say something that you kind of preempted in some ways, but it's not in the paper right now, namely that in economic sanctions, you have sort of one state against another state, and it's a kind of a different setup, really. It's this kind of violence. Here you're dealing with violence against an oppressor, and typically the government imposing the sanctions wants these people to rise up against the local government. So it's kind of a different setup. Though I should say that you should acknowledge that and maybe speak a little bit to the large issue on dual use goods. There was a lot of work on Cold War sanctions, and that would be kind of interesting, what we learn from your design about those kinds of things, just as a general note. My one comment on a couple of comments really on your empirical design. Difference in difference is nice, which is simple, right? I wonder whether you've considered an instrumental variable approach by having sort of this shock hit wealth in a particular unit, and then this shock in wealth will percolate into political violence, and why you haven't followed that route. It might help, especially given that your measures are quite noisy, given that they're at this level, right? So basically, you assume that primarily this local unit is hit, but we're not sure that this is true, because probably people get jobs who don't come from this unit, and so basically they lose their jobs too. And violence, of course, also percolates spatially. I wonder whether there's some econometric way in which you can kind of counter that. But sort of more importantly, and this is the political science in me versus sort of the economic aspect of the story, I wonder whether you compare it with some stories, right? What is happening really? Who is attacking who? Do we have any survey evidence? Can you get some survey evidence of people talking, okay, I lost my job, this is what happened, they started throwing stones at the Israelis, whatever. This is kind of really sorely lacking right now in the paper, and it seems to me that there'll be big gains even from sort of small digging up of details such as those, if you're trying to sell this paper to political scientists, of course. So that's me.
Rebecca added 2, so do not forget that comment.
Yeah, so on this point, in terms of like trying to look at the costs and benefits that the actors are making in terms of going into violence. So I also was kind of a bit concerned over, are we talking about this is set up in a way of opportunity costs, therefore more numbers of individuals, more people are getting involved in conflict, although because this is already an ongoing conflict, is it not just intensity? And so wanting to find out more from you on why exactly it wouldn't be a case of, okay, going to find another job, but what are the motivations there for someone freshly either engaging in conflict whereas they wouldn't otherwise, and what that recruitment process is like as well?
To pile on quickly with the two, related, I had this interest. I'm just like, okay, are new people brought in, or new people being brought into the conflict, or are the same exact people that were there ramping up their effort? And I realize that's hard to differentiate, but in kind of getting at what the different kind of arguments are within the literature, to be able to come up with any distinctions there, I thought would be extremely important. Rod, were you on a 2 or a 1? Just give me a finger, dude. 1 or 2? 1 or 2? 2, go ahead.
Okay, so this follows nicely on from what you just said, Christian. So I was thinking about, trying to rule out alternate explanations, especially from the kind of the human rights repression approach, right? And so some of the things that we know the Israelis do, which could also be a potential source of violence, would be things like, the targeted assassinations, targeted killings that they engage in, and also the house demolitions that they engage in. And there is data on this stuff. There is the more general argument about the use of, physical integrity rights violations as a potential source of violence. And as far as I can tell, none of these types of measures are in your analysis. And I think these are important ones you want to be able to at least include, right? Because I think they're also, potential sources of violence as backlash against the Israelis.
Leonardo.
Okay, so a lot of good questions here. Okay, so the first one, I think like you all hit a bush again and again, which is somehow trying to unpack. I'm going to use this political violence. So my outcome variables on political violence. So which kind of political violence here are we talking about? High intensity, low intensity, and who are the perpetrators? New guys, old guys. So the data that we are using in this data set, and the data that we are using in this paper, which we discovered actually fairly recently, only in June, the data are pretty amazing, and we are not like using all the potential of the data at the moment. So I think we have to do a better job here. Those data are like, the nice thing, they are dyadic, so we know the source and we know the target. We know those are like not only on political violence, but they're like on any hostile act. We select specifically like the one that involve like political violence, they involve violent acts, and they also have a measure of intensity, which is between -10, meaning like a highly intense political violent act, and between -10, -1 being not particularly like violent act. We don't distinguish at the moment between different like acts, different intensity of acts. We put them all together. However, the large majority of those violent acts are of high intensity. For example, like the median is -8. And if we only consider like the very violent act, so intensity -10, -9, or -8, results are pretty much the same, because those are like the large majority of violent acts. Now, the interesting question here is why, so two things here like related to the outcome variable. So why are we considering, I think that was Rod's point, why are we considering both political violent acts against Palestinians and the Israeli? So why not only the Israeli? And because the opportunity cost story, if you buy the opportunity cost story, it doesn't matter. You become more violent, and as you are more likely to engage with conflict, both against your fellow citizens, the Palestinian policemen that maybe get you doing something that you're not supposed to do, against your own fellow citizens, even if they're not policemen, because maybe they support the other side. We know like there are like many factions in the West Bank, and you know you are doing the same with your fellow citizens than with the Israeli. In fact, you know, our research design is as such that if we want to push the opportunity cost story even more, you might even think about testing these on crimes, like, you know, theft of cars. You know, there is a paper, great paper by Guy Grossman on that, and you know, this is like completely in line with our story. You get poorer, and you are more likely to engage with any type of political violence, even stealing cars. Since the crime literature is not particularly important in political science, we believe, we decided like more to focus on political violence. So in my opinion, it's actually like an interesting result that like political violence is both against Palestinians and Israel, and actually like it's an important implication also of the paper, because it also shows that security motivated trade restrictions might create political instability in the targeted country that you are like, you know, that Israel aims to control by increasing killings, or for example, of people who are like against Hamas. The last thing that I think that's the most difficult one to address is that at the moment we cannot distinguish. We don't have data on the individual perpetrator, so we don't know from the data set if these are like new guys or old guys. And since we are talking about 20,000 violent acts in our like in our period, 20,000, it's pretty difficult to dig into each of that. So what we are, and you know, retrieve the violent act and then figure out the perpetrator and see like if it was a new guy or was like someone who was already involved in violent acts. So what we are doing now, we are doing for the major ones, we are doing like a search using like LexisNexis and Factiva. So this is going to give also anecdotal evidence. We will not do anything too systematic, I'm afraid. And here, like for the information that we were able to retrieve, we find that half of those events for which we were able to find information on the newspapers online from reputable sources, half of those events are perpetrated by people who had nothing to do with political violence before, suggesting that like there are also new entries in the fighting camp. But this is not something we can do systematically for all the violent acts because there are too many. That's the downside. So I really would like to do that.
Anna, you had it too.
Yeah, it was a 2 at some point. Now I think it might be
also 1.5.
But I'll say it anyhow. So the paper, the Guy Grossman paper that you mentioned, I'm one of the co-authors of that paper. The other is Austin Wright. So in that paper, we look at car thefts by Palestinians in Israel, and specifically at how separation barrier that Israel constructs on the border between Israel and the West Bank affects those car thefts. And that brings me actually to the comment that I wanted to make to you. So you focus on this export control measure. But at the same time, there are many other measures that Israel enacts in the West Bank. So this is not the only policy that is happening in that time. And one of the biggest changes is basically the separation barrier, as well as different changes in structure of roads that restrict a lot of movements, not just of goods, but also of people within the West Bank. And this currently is completely not part of your paper in any way. So this is like a huge potential alternative explanation to the finding that you report here. Because around 2008 and 2009, there is expansion of the separation barrier to the southern areas of the West Bank, especially around Bethlehem, Hebron, and so on. So I don't know to what extent the results that you report are geographically concentrated in those areas, but if they are, the separation barrier is something that you crucially have to account for around these years. That's all.
Thank you. So thanks for this. So, I'm sorry that that you were like one of the authors. Guy Grossman read our paper and said we should write something together on using your design and crime. That's why I thought that like was like a nice compliment to our story, which is we want to sell as a conflict story, because I don't think there is a market for a large market for crime in political science. In fact, I think you guys are going to econ journals. So it's so this thing of like, so you said like a few things lumped together. So one thing is that we don't find our analysis at the locality level, we have 570 localities. Okay, and we have locality fixed effect. So everything like happen within locality. We don't have evidence that those events are clustered. If we use Conley standard error to account for spatial correlation, which is again like something like is usually done, our results are pretty much the same. Since I got the comments again on spatial correlation also before, I think here like we will need a test to defend a little bit more convincingly Sutva using like a spatial autoregressive model, so to really account for that. So we haven't done that, but this is something that this is a check that we can do. We can do in the next paper. One thing you said that is very important for us is that you said that the mobility of people is reduced. And this is very important for us because, again, we are at the locality level. And one of the comments that we usually get is, why, if I get poor in locality X, I should perpetrate a political act in locality X? Those localities are very close one to another. And our like usual answer to the question is because mobility, especially like people mobility, is limited. And so in that sense, the fact that like mobility is limited is an asset for us because it mitigates concern about spillover effect and so a violation of Sutva. By the way, if you have serious spillover effects, we will find that like our results will be much weaker, right? Because if I get poor in locality X because the level of the intensity of dual use list is high, and I commit and I perpetrate a violent act in another locality with low level of intensity, that would actually like reduce the significance of our estimate and the magnitude of our effect. So the spillover effect here like works against our finding. But this is a good point, and in short, I think we need to like work a little bit better on spatial interdependence of units here.
Rebecca, sorry.
No, I didn't answer to some of the comments and some of the very, very good comments about like instrumental variable and public opinion data. But I would prefer to hear what you want to say. But I haven't forgot those points.
You can also go back to the recording, so don't worry about missing anything. Rebecca.
Yeah, I just wanted to push you, Leonardo, on what you're saying about how, if we can push this explanation to as far as possible, then basically we should see that these actors are targeting anyone and it doesn't matter who. But I just wonder if we're thinking about this in terms of the sender has information, the target has information, and so does the public, or basically the employees at this moment, then really kind of, at least can these two arguments be compatible in terms of trying to push the opportunity costs argument as far as possible, whilst kind of taking away that rationality or intention from the actors in terms of being able to actually respond to a situation, absorb that information, and kind of calculate a strategy?
So this is a very important comment, but I'm afraid, and it's because of me, I'm slow, I didn't get it. So can you make it this? Because I think that's a very important comment. I want to make sure like I understand it.
Yeah, of course. So earlier you were explaining how if you can push this opportunity cost argument as far as possible, then basically it doesn't matter who the target is in terms of the political violence. What matters is that this is an opportunity for those people that are losing their jobs. But I guess I just have trouble with that in terms of looking at this as a sanctioning exercise where there is a sender and there's a target and then there's the public, and it takes away that rationality really in terms of being able to, you know, because part of your story is about grievances and being able to process that, and for the people that have lost their jobs to be able to identify a cause and a reaction and the strategy that follows that with the actors that they join to then engage in political violence.
Yeah, so that's a good point. But if I understand this correctly, I mean, it goes back also to something I said at the beginning about, so earlier on about, you know, the counterfactual and what is the strategy of the sender and how like the receiver reacts to the sender. In a sense that, you know, in our story, the sender, so Israel, implements security-motivated trade restrictions to make more difficult for the Palestinian fighters to build their own guns. If we are right, our reasoning is that Israel did not take into account that by banning those inputs had also had a negative effect on firms' output and wages of firms and employees in those firms, and nothing to do with we were not part of of any fighting group. So. But as a result of that, as a result of those inputs become more expensive, and as a result of the trade distortions in the economy created by the de facto banning of dual use, you have a negative economic shock that makes people poorer. And when people are poorer, they have less to lose economically. And less to give up when they are moving from the formal economy to the informal economy of political violence. And so if this story is correct, I don't see why we should not see an effect in general on violence, theft, even if you want damages to properties, because there are just like more people out there that are involved in illegal activities, because working in the formal economy is not as remunerative as it was before the de facto banning. So you see,
Can I jump in? And I just asked to, because the segue is really nice to some general points that I want to make, or a general point I want to make to hopefully pull together a lot of this. And then I want to actually go to a different point, which is my point. So what you've just done right there was a much more detailed discussion of something that when you're talking to economists, you don't need to say much. But when you're talking to political scientists, you do. When I look at your abstract, and of course you may only be intending to publish in the econ journal, so that's completely different. But I look in your abstract, you know, a political scientist is going to want to see really clearly sanctions lead to unemployment, leads to labor for insurgents. One thing that you did not say just now, but we're probably thinking, it's just an obvious implicit assumption, but you should state it, is that, you know, that is going to increase when as unemployment rises, that is going to increase the attractiveness of lesser jobs, right? Either in higher risk or lower wages, right? So, you know, you don't speak at all about what, you know, becoming an insurgent is. And there are counter stories about how when you're an insurgent, you get you literally get your family, you know, life, you know, health insurance, you get status, you get your, you know, you get your picture on the wall. You're acting like that doesn't happen, but it does. So now that maybe that's irrelevant, right? Because it is a high risk. My point is, you don't talk at all about where that labor becoming an insurgent for a Palestinian is relative to these manufacturing. You're assuming that these manufacturing jobs, which require these inputs, are much better jobs, right? And I think any economist will be like, yeah, no problem. But political scientists will not necessarily connect that, and to connect this then to, I think empirically most political scientists are going to want to see the sanctions to unemployment link, which economists aren't going to, but these are just very different styles of thinking, right? But I want to push you on, to try to pull together all the different comments about what I'll call an endogeneity of dissent and repression, and to put it in the most general terms I can think of. Given any arbitrary temporal aggregation unit, days, weeks, months, years, whatever it is you want to choose, right? It's hard for me to believe that you guys don't think that independent of wages or independent of unemployment or labor supply or any of that, there is going to be a non-trivial relationship between dissent and repression. You're effectively asking us vis-a-vis that claim to believe that you're either aggregating over time at a unit where you've closed off that back door, right? There is no endogeneity between those two, or you need to somehow model it empirically, right? And and I'm very comfortable changing units of time, temporal aggregation. We don't discuss it at all in the discipline. Economists are much more likely to than political scientists, but you guys don't talk about it either. You don't mention it at all. And so, why is that? So think about all those different comments you're getting about, no, I think what the state does matters, and you've got it in a variety of ways, right? Well, you don't. Why not? And I think, being biased and thinking that it does matter, I think it's because you're an economist who's thinking about labor. And so that to me is the endogeneity. Okay, so that's the wrap-ups. There's a series of papers that involve Jake Shapiro that directly challenge your finding that you need to engage. And so I'm going to read you an abstract from, and I can actually send you his website right now. This is from an abstract. It's a paper in the Journal of Conflict Resolution in 2011 with Berman, Callan, Felter, and Shapiro. And they write, contrary to the opportunity cost theory, so they are working exactly with the model you're working with. Contrary to the opportunity cost theory, the data emphatically reject a positive correlation between unemployment and attacks against government and allied forces. And that's the most direct rejection of finding that's inconsistent with your theory and findings. But Shapiro's been involved in a variety of others. These are all, by the way, the kinds of studies you're talking about. I don't know if you know Ellie Berman, he's a labor economist, and he's working with a bunch of political scientists. So Jake, is the co-author on 4 or 5 papers.
I know him.
Oh, okay. So I control.
I was at Princeton 1 year, so I know him.
Oh, well, okay. So, like one of the things I did was, as I got through the abstract, I'm like, okay, let me check and make sure Shapiro's cited in here, and there's no discussions. And I just find out, since you're hanging your hat on an empirical strategy, you don't talk about findings that are the opposite? I don't know.
So I think that thanks for pointing it out, that like our bad. So we should have we should have cited him. We do cite in the introduction many studies that find weak effect of poverty in general. So poor economic conditions on conflict. We are aware that empirically there is actually weak evidence that the opportunity cost, if you want, related to poverty triggers terrorism. We have fairly sophisticated game theoretic model. I'm thinking here about like one of the Mosquito work showing why the opportunity cost theoretically makes sense, although those models are like way sophisticated and theoretically with what we can do here in a reduced form. But we are aware of the fact that the opportunity cost argument is not obvious, and in fact actually is fairly controversial. So I think we should cite Shapiro. I should read the paper that I think I've seen before, but I think in a working paper version. So I have to read it again. Otherwise, I want to understand better the research design. But I know that he's very careful on that. So, but the point is that I'm not sure this is though. It's something that works against us in a sense and makes our result, if you buy our research design, if you buy our finding, makes our result at least not obvious, because there is generally no a consensus that poor economic conditions trigger conflict.
But I think it would be interesting. I mean, I would think you would want to try to engage, because you've got a very particular kind of labor market shock that is different from theirs. It's also in different countries and da-da-da-da-da. So, it's really an interesting, there's a story about trade, right? So I don't have a story for you, but I would try to engage it if you can think of a reason, from that perspective, not just the way I presented it was kind of crude, just, oh, it's a different finding, right? But I think it might be an opportunity.
It's a good point, but so the reason why we are writing this paper and we were convinced that there is something here is because if you look at the first stage in which we show the effect at the sectoral level on wages and at the locality level on wages, those two effects are very similar in terms of timing. They both happen in 2009, 2010. They are comparable in magnitude, and it's not trivial. And they come from very different sources in the way that we build our intensity measure, MS, ML, and they we use different data, different unit of analysis, sector year versus locality year, and still we find there's exactly the same effect in exactly the same year. That's when we said, okay, so we have a paper here on the second stage, because if you buy the economic condition negative shock, then you're more likely to buy the political violence part. Then it's up to you how much you buy this as a causal argument or not. But in a sense, it's pretty remarkable that two very different tests on the first stage show pretty much exactly the same effect. And it's true.
I agree.
Anna had a further contextualization, and then Rod.
Yeah, I was also puzzled by your argument that you're the first to estimate the effect of security measures on the economy, given that there are papers about it. So one of the recent papers is by Longo, Canetti, and Haidt in APS. It's about the West Bank. And they look at the removal of checkpoints, both of the public opinion in the Palestinian areas affected by the removal of those checkpoints. So that paper is not cited. There is another paper by Efi Ben Melek, Claude Berby, Esteban Clor. I think it's titled the economic cost of hosting harvests, JCR 2010 bank, and about how security measures against communities of origin of suicide bombers result in bad economic outcomes in those communities in the form of wages, unemployment, as well as employment in Israel. I have a paper that is currently R&R with Togas and Mazdemir on the effect of suicide attacks on land confiscation in the context of the West Bank. And we know that land confiscation also leads to a lot of bad economic outcomes for Palestinians. And so I wouldn't make the argument that you're the first to recognize this effect.
Rod, you also had it too, and then to Leonardo.
Yeah. So I was gonna agree with the points that Will made, and at least from my own sense, reading the argument about kind of the economic costs and then the more general violence, is that it just it feels a little bit like sort of conceptual stretching to me, right? If you want to make that case, you've got to make a really tight case. And then I think, at least to me, it's creating enemies there where you don't need to have any, right? So you can have theoretical links that get you to political rights, but at the moment it's kind of framed as, one or the other. And you can just say, look, here are some different ways that get you to political violence. And we may not be able to distinguish those with our tests, right? But here at least are some plausible sets of reasons as to how we get there. That to me is, I think, will probably better reflect the data you have. Because at the moment, with the case that you're trying to make, I don't think you can demonstrate that you have. And then this just relates to one other quick point is, again, this is about sort of ruling out alternate explanations, right? How can you rule out is not simply criminality associated with increased levels of poverty and where these people live, right? So they've lost their jobs and now they're just engaged in stealing or whatever the case might be. Part gets to being able to demonstrate that your dependent variable actually is one that political behavior. And again, there's no description of why it is. You tell us it is, and I believe you, but you need to be able to persuade a reviewer that information actually, the measure is actually valid, right? Especially if it's something that will do it.
Leonardo.
Again, so Rod makes always very general point. He's like, it will be my least favorite referee because it's you cannot grab him. I think that we are not able to disentangle exactly like the opportunity cost story for the grievances stories. Point taken. I'm not sure if we would ever have. And so this is something we have to think a little bit more. I think the data that we are using at the moment are like, I think in this sense, the most disaggregated that we can. In terms of like criminality, again, I don't have anything against an argument that says that negative economic conditions trigger both violent acts which are related to the Israeli-Palestinian conflicts and also more kind of like criminal acts that would be like would happen also in an area in which there are no economic pre-existing political tensions. I would not deny this story because it's totally consistent with the theoretical framework, and it's totally consistent with our first stage, which is a first stage showing like an impoverishment of some localities as a result of those security motivated trade restrictions. However, I think we will do better in the future. You're right on describing our outcome variables, and I think we can be more transparent. And as I said, we can do more with outcome variables. We can definitely rule out very easily. We don't do it now, but we can do we'll do that in the next version of the paper. That those are what we are only predicting here are events, low-scale events, so low-level criminality. This is something we can rule out very, very easily by looking into those violent acts. As I mentioned, those are like usually high-intensity acts. So it means like stabbing a policeman, throwing stone to a policeman, shooting a civilian. So those are like those kind of like what I would say high scale acts made the vast majority of the violent acts in our outcome variables, and so this is not only a criminality story. It's not driven by a low-level criminality story, although the criminality story is totally in line with that. And there are other mechanisms. You mentioned the human rights, violent acts related to human rights. I didn't really get the argument. But if this is the case, you have to convince me that the human rights changed pre and post 2008, and this change in human rights violation correlates with our intensity measure. So you have to convince me that in the locality in which we have high intensity of dual use input, you somehow after 2008 you have more violent act related to human rights, which to me seems like a kind of a far-fetched story. So this is go back to the idea of the difference in difference. I care about confounding factors if and only if they change pre and post 2008, and if and only if those confounding factors are correlated with my intensity variable. And again, I cannot make sense of an argument that says you have more human rights violations in localities in which the intensity is high. The last thing I want to say, because you gave me a lot of nice citations. I hope that I've received some of the citations also by email, because I was not able to write down all the names. So this was very very helpful. Thank you so much. But the last thing about public opinion data, because few of you touched on that, and I'm totally with you. So I would love to use public opinion data. I think public opinion data would be actually a way to understand a little bit more how important the grievances story is, because ideally you want to see how many people, for example, even without being fighters, they justify violent acts against Israeli, or you might even see how many people, for example, are in favor of Hamas in those localities with high intensity of dual-use goods. Unfortunately, the public opinion data that we are aware of are only at the district level. So we will move from having 570 localities to having 10 districts. And this kind of reduces a lot all the appeal of the paper. As far as I know, there is nothing. So we cannot basically georeference responded at the locality level, not with the data that are available there. So again, we can show something more anecdotal, something more descriptive with those data at the district level. But as far as I know, and if you have suggestions, I would love to hear them. We don't know of any public opinion data that survey people at the locality level. Those questions I mentioned are all in those public opinion data run by Israel. So there are questions of, do you justify violent acts against Israeli civilians? Do you justify violent acts against Israeli soldiers? But we're not able to find anything at the locality level. So if you know of any data, please let me know, because I agree that public opinion data would be very helpful to corroborate some of our findings.
Okay, Katja had some comments on framing. Before going there though, I would suggest if you get anybody who's in the subnational conflict crowd and you're not a little bit clear with regards to your conception of political violence, then that's going to be problematic, right? So your intensity variable, if the state is involved as a perpetrator, is in all likelihood a human rights violation. So you need to be careful about how you're parsing stuff, because they're going to be, you have terrorism people, you have armed conflict people, you got civil war people, you got human rights violations people, and right now you've kind of lumped them.
No, but it's very important. We say this in the paper, and maybe we have to stress this more. Remember, those are violent acts perpetrated by Palestinian civilians. So we do not count any violent act perpetrated by the government.
That's right. That's why Will went into his comment about the dynamics. Yeah. So
those are only private citizens that many of them, if you look at more qualitatively those episodes, many of them are people that don't even have a grand plan. Or you mentioned the benefits of being a fighter, that you have name recognition. If you look at qualitative at those events, those are people that some of those violent acts are people that are stopped with a car by an Israeli policeman, and they do something stupid. they take out a knife and try to stab him. So, you know, in a sense that, like, you know, often there is no a grant of those violent acts that we are able to trace online. So often, like, there is no like a grand plan. They're not like, you know, carefully planned and on everything. So this is related to one of the previous point on the benefits of being a terrorist, which, you know, we don't deny that there are benefits like to be a terrorist. In our like setting is enough that those benefits don't change before and after 2008, and so then the only thing that changes is the cost of being a terrorist, which is higher before 2008 than after 2008, because before 2008 I make more money than after 2008.
Katja.
Okay, a short note on just sort of a suggestion on how you might frame the paper, since right now you're touching on a lot of different literatures, and it's still not entirely clear where your best contribution really lies in the things that you're talking about. And this, you know, take it or leave it, this may not be the most sort of ambitious one for you, but I would really go back to Will's suggestion of talking more about the sanctions literature, because there is really a large amount of both theorizing and frankly not that good empirical testing for a lot of it on what the domestic effects of economic sanctions actually are, how sanctioned populations actually respond to economic sanctions. And we rarely observe sanctions at the extreme that are as effective as what you're presenting here in the case of these dual use lists, right? So you actually have a pretty, I think you need to be tighter about how the economic effects link to the motivations of the people perpetrating the violence, but from the way you talk about it, you know what it is you're trying to convince people of here, and you have some conception of how that linkage actually happens, and I think more of that needs to be in the paper. But given that you actually have that, it's not something that we see a whole lot of in the sanctions literature. The sanctions literature, which I've dealt with a bit and written on, more written than published actually, tends to be a little hand-wavy about how precisely this is going to work, and certainly how it turns out in the empirical testing of it. And because you have such cool data, this would really be a place where you could make a real and in fact novel contribution, I believe. And there are established arguments about rallying effects and backlash and things of that nature that you could really speak to here and actually have a strong empirical case to make that there's something in addition going on here. One caveat to this, and I know that sort of the last paragraph in the conclusion of any article, especially a manuscript draft, tends to be a bit of a throwaway, but you're making the argument that you have a very specific example here and that there might be some concerns over how well this is going to travel. And I think we've heard from several discussants today that, you know, we share these concerns. You're going to have to take that a bit more seriously, I think. And simply the argument that, oh, we see violence even against, you know, an opposition that is as strong as the Israeli army, and if they can't deter it, then nobody can. Well, maybe, but A, it's a pre-existing conflict that's already radicalized a large part of the population, which is not something you usually see. The second thing is that you do have an economic impact of this particular economic sanction here that you're not going to see in a lot of other places, simply because Israel is able to control the borders so completely. There's very little leakage. And I agree with Anna that there's probably smuggling and there are other things going on, but these are all very high cost, high risk activities that normally if you're being sanctioned, you're not necessarily forced to engage in these kinds of activities, right? So Israel has a pretty tight grip and can control and can impose sanctions that are much more costly than you would necessarily see otherwise. So I'm wondering a little bit whether it wouldn't make sense if you're looking to expand this, or maybe in a follow-on paper, to compare this particular instance to something similar in a different locale where the grip of the sanctions isn't quite as tight, right? And you can make some arguments about how costly the sanctions are and how it makes a difference that Israel does have such a tight control, things like that. But I would encourage you to take another closer look at the sanctions literature, because it's long, it's policy relevant, it's, well, it fits with what you're talking about, and it's really a place where you could make a real contribution here.
So quickly, before you go there, Leonardo, because you're a responder, dude. I like you. But so my quick two was, one, I definitely support that. I noticed that you kind of buried the economic sanctions literature. That was like the third literature you referenced, and that was the first one that came to mind for me. But related to that, it just like, I wondered about the kind of conflict cycle dynamics, right? So I don't think this particular intervention would have worked in the context of the Intifada, right? Because you had a particular mobilization strategy and people were diffusing strategies in a particular way. There was more or less clarity with regards to how things were being diffused. And so I think there's something about that particularity that like directly kind of stands in there. But also you were kind of missing discussions of like the mobilizing structure of the challenging institutions. So you were kind of lumping together random individuals out on the street with the kind of organization-specific kind of mobilization activities. And I'm wondering if you were able to parse those to get some sense of the kind of general kind of quotidian average sabotage versus the ramping up. So I kind of mentioned this earlier before, but I noticed that we kind of conflated that a little bit later on. Will, do you want to give Leo, sorry, Leo, I don't know you that well to call you by like Leo, but
yeah, actually, Leonardo, if you want to say anything, we're actually a little over time and we need to close, but you're welcome to have the floor, and then I'll close us out.
I have to say only thank you so much for like taking the time to discuss so thoroughly for 1 hour and a half my paper and to give me like such a hard time, which is at the right moment. This is version like draft 2.0, so it's like the second like draft of the paper. So we obviously have still a lot of work to do. And thank you so much for like being so thorough in your comments. And yeah, so this last point is again about trying to figure out more who are the perpetrators. It goes in the same direction. Also, are part of the usual fighters. They fight also the Intifada of like there are new guys. And I like the suggestion of pushing on the literature economic sanction. So I didn't contribute to the list, so I didn't want to say that like it's empirically weak. But since you said that, I would agree that it's empirically weak, as the human rights literature maybe, like it's another one. And so we would, in a sense, yes, I think would be appealing to speak to the literature. The second comment though that you made about external validity, it makes me wonder if we push too much on the economic sanction, people will say, yeah, but you have a very, very specific environment to test economic sanction. A lot of economic sanctions are not like that, and a lot of countries don't have the same power than Israel has on the West Bank when they impose economic sanctions. So that's why it's listed number 3. But we think more. Maybe you're wrong. We have to. Maybe it's the smart and strategic thing to do. But as soon as like the economic sanction is the main framing on the paper, then if someone works on economic sanction would be right in raising an issue about external validity. So how much those findings can travel to other studies. So that's why we are a little bit reluctant. Although I totally take your point. Other than that, thank you so much. It was great to meet you or to see you again on Skype. And if you have any written comments, please send it to me. That would be very helpful, and I would appreciate that.
Okay. Well, thank you everybody for serving as a discussant. This is actually our final session, virtual workshop of the fall. We will be doing a call for papers as soon as I get my button gear and get that, probably in a week or so. So please encourage people. Leonardo, you and your co-authors, thank you so much. We are interested in conflict consortium, a community, and we love to get papers from economists and sociologists. We haven't yet found a single psychologist, but we have hope that maybe we'll get one someday. And I think probably I know I speak for me and probably several of the others. Completely unfamiliar with your work. Delighted that that you're interested in doing this sort of stuff. So again, props to the people who do all the work and don't get any recognition other than having their names and faces on YouTube, which is probably not a positive. All right. Thanks, everybody. Be well.
Thank you. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.